Okay, welcome. Thank you for joining us if you're joining now, and welcome to Nathalie Etoke, who is going to be in conversation with me for the next 40 minutes. I'm sorry we're a little bit late starting with this session because we had some technical issues and we also had some power cuts in real time. So we will still be spending, I think, Sabine, if it's all right, 40 minutes talking and doing this conversation with
Absolutely.
Nathalie. Is that
Absolutely.
okay? Okay, all right. So let me start by introducing Nathalie. Nathalie Toke is Associate Professor of Francophone and Africana Studies at the Graduate Center, CUNY, the City University of New York. Her articles have appeared in Research in African Literatures, French Politics and Culture, Nouvelles Études Francophones, Présence Francophone, the International Journal of Francophone Studies, and the Journal of French and Francophone Philosophy. She is the author of L'écriture du corps féminin dans la littérature de l'Afrique. My French is just
It's
going
all right. You're doing great.
and of Melancholia Africana, which won the 2012 Frantz Fanon Prize from the Caribbean Philosophical Association. In 2011, she directed Afro-Diasporic French Identities, a documentary on race, identity, and citizenship in contemporary France. A woman of many talents, and it is our absolute, joy and pleasure to have you here. So welcome once again, and thank you for being with us to have this conversation. I've been reading your book, which is very exciting and is published just hot off the press, Shades of Black, published by Seagull Books, and is part of the series that is Leonora is editing. And I would recommend people to get the book and also to get Leonora's book and read it if you haven't done so already, because these really sort of exciting texts and important texts are going, I think, should be part of our vocabulary as we go forward. So Nathalie, I've introduced you formally, but I'd like to give you an opportunity to introduce yourself as how you would like to. So I am going to start with a question. How often do you get asked, where are you from? Where are you when that happens? And how do you choose to respond?
Oh, I get that question a lot, but it's very important to say that it started happening once I moved to France to go to college. I was born there, but I didn't grow up in France. I grew up in Cameroon, Central Africa. So at first, it didn't really bother me per se. It was because once you realize that you actually have a country, that it is your country and where your family is from, it shouldn't be a problem
Mm-hmm.
when people ask you where you're from. But you have to contextualize that question. So in France, when I was asked where I was from, it was not because of my accent, because quote unquote, I do not have an African accent, whatever that is supposed to mean. It's more about people trying to reconcile a lot of things that have nothing to do with you, but a certain kind of script they have in their mind. So I will tell you a little story. A few years ago, I was on my way back to Paris for spring break because Leonora and I used to have these literary events, conferences, talks, and film screening, etc. So it was somewhat of a tradition for me to go back to France every spring and to also see my family. So I'm at the airport. So the white immigration officer, because you have to go to immigration, and you have different lines depending on your citizenship. So if you're a citizen from the European community, you have a specific line or more lines, and if you come from elsewhere, usually the global south,
Mm-hmm.
and you have another line. So I was there, and then you have this young man who grabs my Cameroonian passport, and it says that I was born in Paris. How come I'm not French? It seems like that's something we should all aspire to. So already there was a certain kind of cognitive dissonance going on. Like he really wants to ask me a question, and then he looks at my green cards, and then he start asking me all kind of questions. So how come I'm not French? I have to tell a story about how French people are always talking about the juris soli, the idea that when you're born on the French soil, you're French. Is actually not true. Not the way we understand it in America. I'm the perfect example. I was born there, but I didn't grow up there. I moved back to Cameroon and came back to France when I was legal. You have to live continuously, at least at the time, at least 5 years, and show some paperwork to show yourself approved. So I'm one of those few people. I know a handful who was born in Paris or wherever else in France, but they're not French. So there's something there already about his assumption. And then this idea of a green card, people know what a green card is. So regardless of your background, there's something about having a green card that already puts you in a certain kind of class or gives you a certain kind of elite status. And then they ask you, I don't know if you're really part of their jobs, where you're from and what you do. So I tell this person I'm a professor. He looks at me like, where, high school? They say, no, university, college. So you see, I'm just trying to go through that gate, okay? I have a place to go. It's a 5 minute conversation, but it's very intense. And people are asking you information that they shouldn't be worried about. I have my visa, I have my passport, just let me go through. But then in the US, there's something about having a black population on American soil for more than 400 years. So until I open my mouth, it's not written that I'm from elsewhere. But then once I start speaking, people are always trying to guess. So it could happen anywhere. I can call my internet provider on the phone because I'm having issues with the internet. And that person will start asking me questions. And it's not always even a racial issue. Could be a person of African American descent. Or my last name, how do you pronounce it? Oh, where is that from? How long have you been in the US? Or it could be at the grocery store, at the park, anywhere. When I'm in a good mood, I can answer the question, and sometimes I'm just rude. I'm not in the mood. I don't feel like giving you personal information about my life just because you hear something in my voice. It doesn't give you the right to interview me. But I also understand that these people feel like they're trying to connect with you. They are showing interest in you. So they don't realize that those questions are actually very intrusive. These are private questions. These are personal questions. You're asking me details about my life that I'm not necessarily willing to share with some random stranger. Okay, but I think they don't have that understanding because it also comes from a place of a certain kind of superiority. Or do you like it here as an immigrant? Do you often go back home? What do you think about this place, etc., etc.? And also when you have this strange trajectory where it's not like you're coming straight from Cameroon to the US, but you were in France first. Now you're here. It adds more to this idea of having a conversation. But I think it's not just about being a foreigner. There's a certain racial dimension in the US also when you're a black person finding yourself in what they call white spaces. You're an anomaly there. So at some point, you always have to justify why you're there. You have to tell your story. You always have a story to share so that people can really deal with the fact that they can either accept you, tolerate you, or for whatever. Your presence is not never taken for granted. So depending on your positionality, people will come at you differently. And sometimes it could also be people who look like you, but who are black people of American descent whose ancestors were enslaved. So I don't try to think too much about it, but it helped me really understand this whole thing about race in relation to positionality, standpoint epistemology, our proximity with gender, race, and sexual orientation can lead to certain kind of conversation. And the fact that even today, a lot of us start talking about ourselves, even in our scholarship, with our identities. There are ways in which there's a centering of identities that I find in overall problematic, but to me, it helps me understand the way the world operates. And I also come from a place where no one was black, there nobody is.
Mm.
But at the same time, your last name sends a message about where you're from. I'm not Nigerian, but I know a difference between a Yoruba name and an Igbo name.
Mm. Mm.
I'm not Senegalese, but I know that a Soninke name is not a Fulani name, you
Mm.
know. But there is not race per se. It's
Mm.
a certain understanding of a culture and a civilization, and you're dealing with another human being, the same way French will meet a German person that acknowledge their history and their humanity, whereas the racial component, whether I like it or not, put me in the context of white supremacy and racial hierarchy, and who is supposed to be somewhere, and someone who's always the guest who has to behave and say thank you all the time, even when it's being abused.
Mhm. 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 Mm. Thank you, Natalie. That's an answer that throws up a lot of food for thought in terms of your location, your personal experiences, and also the broader context of how identity politics is determined by the place that you're in. So certainly when you're in a place of whiteness, as you're describing it, the question that people ask you of where you're from is not a question that is completely innocent or is completely powerless, even though the intentionality might not be there. And this is where we get into realms of unconscious bias and things that people agree or disagree on. But certainly you're talking and asking a question in a place where there's a particular type of power dynamic between black and white, between brown and white, between all kinds of colors, and therefore, it's like, as you say, that you don't see that many, that question has the same connotations when you're asking of that question of people who are at home in the culture that they're in, right? So and I think so it's that question of being at home, where is home and what does home mean? And you've been at the intersection of three countries, Cameroon, France, and the US, and you've brought that up in your question, and sorry, in your answer, and in your book Shades of Black, and you referred to this just now as well. You talk about the rise of identity politics with a need for recognition, reparation, and justice. And you are sort of say that some African Americans may regard their social position as a form of injustice and imposture. So, can you elaborate on that?
My social position, right? Not theirs.
Yeah. Well, I'm sort of I stopped at the quote from you, but
Okay,
I thought I'll,
okay.
I'll sort of let you tell us about
Yes,
it.
I just want to be specific here. I'm talking about a specific group of people, not African Americans in general. I've been particularly interested in some of the conversation that are happening online. They call themselves the black media, because I think there are ways in which today, thanks to social media, people can really have dissident and transgressive conversations online. I don't necessarily think that the conversations we're having in academia about race necessarily speaks to the interest of some of the working class black people in America. There's a certain sense of disconnect. And what I learned about those conversations was the existence, for instance, of this group, ADOS. This is the group that I'm talking about, American descendant of slavery. The leaders of this group, Yvette Carnell and Antonio Moore, are actually advocating for a disaggregation of blackness in order to redistribute resources and create access for a specific group, right? The American descendant of slavery. They problematize the ways in which there is a certain kind of flattening of blackness that occurs in America that does not benefit black Americans whose ancestors were enslaved. For instance, you see, I could be perceived or even identify as a black woman, so a double minority. So the statistics can use me to advance this idea that the academia is becoming more and more diverse. Well, there's a breakdown of data that needs to occur if we're really talking about redistribution and affirmative action. Who are actually the black people who have access to higher learning, higher education? Who are the black people who are able to go to med school? I'm not sure about the statistic, but there was a year when there's a study that came out about the fact that the black population at the Harvard Business School was predominantly of Nigerian descent. And, but then they are accounted for as black. So the ADOS people are coming from that perspective where there is a flattening of blackness that erase their historical condition and their oppression. And also, there are ways in which people from the right, like Candace Owens, can constantly bring up Nigerians, not because she cares about Nigerians or African immigrants or Caribbean immigrants, but she will bring them up to showcase their quote unquote success, success of American blacks or immigrants who just got here and doing so well. How come people who've been here for 400 years are still complaining about racism? They have to quote unquote live the democratic plantation because racism becomes this idea of a mindset or a trap, mental slavery. So there's a problem there with the ways in which we understand blackness today with regards to resources, redistribution of wealth, and access. Who are actually the blacks who are making it? But I even question the whole idea of making it. I think we'll discuss that later. And the symbolism attached to this idea of black success in a capitalist imperialist democracy. So just in a nutshell, to contextualize that quote.
Okay, okay. So thank you for contextualizing that quote and for raising that really important concern about resources and the redistribution of wealth and the question of access and how certain elites can have that you can be African, you can be black, and you can be also Asian or any other
Exactly.
color, but coming from elite backgrounds or networking in a particular type of context can make you have access to similar privileges as whiteness. So you can be part of the story of whiteness, or you can also actually behave in the same way that that sort of white privilege does. But
But to be
we'll,
fair, just one last thing, they do not address the fact that even that view, I understand their point, but there is a certain kind of fallacy there because even amongst black immigrants, we are not quote unquote at the same level. When you look at the Somali, who are mostly refugees, their economic situation is different from that of the Ethiopian community. Or when you think at people who come from Liberia, so there's a certain focus on certain groups, on certain countries, and their quote unquote success that erases that even amongst black immigrants from the Caribbean or from West Africa or East Africa, you have social economic disparities. So even the ways in which they're questioning the flattening of blackness, they're also flattening, the black experience immigrants by creating this idea that somehow we are all elite and benefit from some type of network. Some do, some does not.
yeah, I think that's an interesting and important distinction that you brought out there in terms of, I suppose, what, like, how do you think of African identity and Black identity, and without flattening it, and to sort of look at the different contours of it, and then within within those spaces, how some identities can exercise more power over others for reasons that are complex, as you pointed out. So and also issues to do with status of being a refugee or being a legal immigrant, and all sorts of things that then become tied to that type of kind of movement politics. So we've talked quite a lot about the US there. What about France? How has French law excluded Black people?
Well, I am not a historian by trade, but what I can tell you based on what I know, I will start with the legislation, the Code Noir, the first Code Noir established by Jean-Baptiste Colbert. It was published in 1685, 2 years after his death, and it allowed French law to deny the humanity of sub-Saharan enslaved people by codifying the modalities of their social domination on plantations, right, in the French overseas colonies. And they always like to talk about how they abolished it, but they never talked about, the chronological sequence. After the abolition of slavery, what do we have? Colonization. There was coerced labor in Africa, but most importantly, thinking about the law again, we have what we call the Code de l'Indigénat, which continued this work of denegation and exclusion of oppressed population of African descent now on the African continent. So whether we're talking about the Code Noir or the Code de l'Indigénat, this legal framework really established and solidified a hierarchy between white French citizens and black French subject, the colonizer versus the colonized, thereby institutionalizing forced labor, racial inequality, violence, and injustice. And people don't want to look at this idea of about the status of black people in the certain kind of framework, which became a law, basically legalizing your subhuman status so that you can be abused and used for years, sometimes for centuries, right? So I think we lived outside of the social and legal framework that structures and guarantees the sacredness of human life. That's what it is. And today, when we talk about racism, is the enduring legacy. The fact that for some reason you can be a citizen of France, you can be a citizen of the US, but because of your race, you will be treated in a certain kind of way. you know, I'm not saying that police brutality doesn't happen to non black people, but we need to look at the statistics. Who's more victimized and in what context? It always amazes me how white terrorists make it alive when they get caught in America. But you can be a black person sitting in your car like Philando Castile with your girlfriend and your baby daughter in the back seat. You're trying to show your permit to carry, and you're dead. Not to remember people who are trying to grab their phone and they shoot them. There's just this easiness with which black people just get shot, men and women. Sandra Bland. You also have those situations in France, but I think in France is at the moment it's more complicated because I'm trying to reconcile police brutality that the yellow vest had to endure with the type of racialized police brutality that people of African descent and people from Northern Africa also have to endure. Some white people were maimed during those protests. So I think there's a little something there that needs to be addressed with regard to the French states and violence and this question of violence and controlling people, even beating people up because they're not wearing a mask. I think the police there really gets overboard these days, but there are ways in which those things used to happen only to people of African descent or people from Northern Africa. But now we can also find many stories about people who are not originally from those places, who are also victims of police brutality. And I still don't know what to make of it. I'm not saying it's the same, but I think it complicates the racialized narrative about police brutality in France. Although I'm sure that statistically, you still have more racialized citizens, meaning black or Arabs, who are being brutalized by the police. But I have to say that I saw young woman losing one eye just because she's out there protesting. That was quite different.
That's really interesting to hear, and it also makes me think of something that's been raised here. I mean, the structural question that you're addressing there in your response. of racism and how it manifest itself through the law, and how important it is to unpack that. For example, we've had a police brutality case with Sarah Everard here, which you might have read the story or come
Yes.
across the story, right? And it's the question is being asked that how come, that there are lots of stories of people of color in which, or black people, as there's a woman who lost her two children,
Two
uh,
daughters. Yeah, I
two
have my
daughters.
sister who lives in that neighborhood. I
Yeah,
heard about it, and she told me that story about the. I think the mother spoke to the media lately,
that's right.
uh,
Yeah,
challenging this racialized outcry because people are outraged. Is it because
people
it's
are
a
outraged
white
over this.
lady?
And why is it that the press doesn't get excited in the same way, when that happens with a black family, to a black family, what, like, surely that's part of some of the structures that we need to address and think about. So while we're on the theme of police brutality, let's go back to the US. Yesterday, 29th March, was the first day of the Derek Chauvin trial. George Floyd's plea to him was heard around the world. I can't breathe. I will probably die this way. This is quoted in the epilogue to your book. Can you take us back to this moment? And what is the longer history of institutional racism in police force in the US? And how you
Oh,
talk about it in your book?
that's a that's I'll try to be brief. I think that people don't want to look at history. I'm not saying that we need to be trapped in our history, but how do we understand what is going on today if we do not unpack the history of this country? So, initially, the police and the courts were not created to protect black people. They were part of a white supremacy system that reinforces white power that people confuse with freedom. Because when you think about it at that time, who was free and who was unfree? Even when you think about what happened after the Civil War and Reconstruction, some African American scholars argue that it was actually the reconstruction of slavery, slavery by another name. When you think about how we went from having a kind of private ownership system, so you can point at a slave master and say that he owns enslaved people. But what happened after abolition of slavery, Reconstruction, and all of that? You have the 13th Amendment that basically tell you that slavery is abolished, right? But I'm paraphrasing here. But under certain circumstances, crime, you can be enslaved again. People should look up the 13th Amendment. It's a very interesting amendment. They are very specific about situations that can lead to your enslavement. So you realize that you always have this willingness to control the black body and black lives in this country. And then you have a convict leasing. What is convict leasing? But another form of slavery. You have peonage. And you have all those strange laws like the vagrancy laws. If they find you walking around somewhere and you don't have a quote unquote a purpose, a job, you'll find yourself in jail. And then the fees just to process the paperwork are so expensive, plus the condemnation that you spend a tremendous amount of time in jail, right? So people want me to believe that all of that is just gone because of 1965 and civil rights, etc. But then we can even go back to Emmett Till. Or you have this little boy, I always forgot his name. He was, I believe, 12 or 13. He was electrocuted. They accused him of sexually assaulted two teenagers, white, and it was a lie. I mean, a 12-year-old, okay? You have Emmett Till. You have Rodney King. You have George Floyd. And there are a lot of other people in between. I mean, the list is long.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
So I don't know. I have this phrase. I don't believe in mysticism, but I think the pandemic, and for whatever cosmic reason, and not even just the videos. We've seen videos before. The Rodney King video is horrible. But there was something about this video being able to circulate on social media all over the world. There are ways in which Americans could do horrible things to black people here and hide everything. They used to question Martin Luther King and ask him, why is it that you bring out your children out there? He had a very, very simple answer. Because the world had to see. And we're all brutalized as a group, as a family. Everybody is brutalized. The women, the children, the husband, the father, the grandfather. There's something about having everything on public display. And I don't think people necessarily react because they think there's something wrong. There's something that I call the politics of shaming, which are very trendy today, and I have a problem with that. But this idea that I'm going to expose you. You know, people recording other people without their knowledge, saying horrible things, and then you lose your job or whatever. So I think there was something about the exposure of this pain, and that man was in such a state of distress. I didn't watch the full video. A friend of mine sent it to me, an African American man, without any type of context, because he's been so used to it. And also the ways in which black people have to constantly make peace with trauma. Because I understand how it's important to show, but why is it that it's always black bodies who are shown that way? And nothing really transformative happens. I realized that I was going through a process of desensitization because you see, and I refuse to watch those videos now. But to go back to your question about a global response, I have mixed feelings about it. Because in many ways, yes, there is solidarity, but at the same time, it's an opportunity to have a conversation that was not happening. There are ways in which solidarity and commodification of Black death sometimes work together. So I'm very excited to see that people in the UK, people in France stood up. But my question is, do you really need George Floyd to do that? Even in post-colonial Africa, people challenge the militarization of the states and police brutality in the name of solidarity. You know, and then in the Middle East, it was very interesting. Some famous actresses put up some black faces and in the name, you know, with the Black Lives Matter hashtag. And there was a backlash, which to me was a very important moment because we are very used to having this conversation about white supremacy when we are dealing with the Western world. But there's another kind of anti-black racism going on really across the globe. I mean, the Aborigines people in Australia also stood up. And what do you make of those actresses who thought that they were showing a certain kind of solidarity? So yes, it brought up a certain kind of awareness, and it allowed a lot of people who have been historically silenced to speak up. But I'm really interested in radical change because to me, this happens every now and again. And after George Floyd's death, many other deaths happened. And before his death, we have Breonna Taylor, Ahmaud Arbery. You see, there was a certain kind of ritualization of Black death, spectacle of Black suffering. And then the co-opting of the energy by politicians who were behind the crime bills or who have harsh policies with regard to mass incarceration of people of color, particularly Black men. You know, how do you reconcile that? Or even when you have Netflix coming up with a Black Lives Matter list of movies that we have to watch. Or this year, you know, Black History Month, you know, supporting Black businesses or reading Black novelists. I'm very not at ease with the ways in which there is this strange situation. You know, neoliberalism and wokeness become bedfellows. You know, what do I make of that when I actually know that they were part of the problem? Even the NFL, who ended Colin Kaepernick career, they all woke now. I mean, it's just, and I think there's something highly pragmatic there because the forces of changes are co-opted and neutralized, and capitalism is advanced.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I think you raised something, well, lots of things that I'm thinking of as you're talking. And one of the things, just to pick up at the end, and I'm so glad you've covered the Black Lives Matter movement in your response. But one of the things I was thinking of as you spoke about that sort of neoliberalism and the response and the inclusivity campaigns, which are really important, but also how diversity can start to take a particular type of neoliberal agenda as well. So we have Black History Month, which is very important, but also, that's like every month should be Black History Month. It shouldn't just be a month that we think about sort of things to do with Black people, right? They don't just come and live here for 1 month. They're here all the time. Everybody's here all the time. So it's those sorts of things that are very meant to be very enabling and are done in the best possible way, but also set up those kind of issues and concerns. So one of the things that I really enjoyed reading in your book, and I think I'd like to draw you out on, is your critique of Barack Obama and new Vice President Kamala Harris, because I think this will pick up that point that you were also talking about with regards to how racism towards Africans doesn't only happen in the US, but is also happening in other parts of that kind of anti-blackness is also part of a wider world. So you say in your book that Barack Obama, Colin Powell, and Condoleezza Rice became fetishes of diversity or fig leaves covering racism. As Black personifications of white supremacy, their main mission is to protect and maintain the interests of American imperialism. So, can you tell us why you don't see these political representatives making a real change when it comes to Black America? And what makes them fetishes of diversity? How do you define diversity, and how do you see it reflected back in society at large?
Well, to start with, let's start with the theoretical statement that I would like to make.
Mhm.
I think there's something very insidious and dangerous that is happening right now in presuming that skin color, gender, or sexual orientation of a person acceding to a high office fundamentally carries a progressive or redemptive political agenda. I think there's something going on with the ways in which we imagine politics, or maybe the lack of imagination, I don't know, where we just ascribe certain qualities to people because of the characteristic that I just mentioned, which, by the way, they did not choose. you know, uh, Skin color, gender, sexual orientation. So there are ways in which those people, because they belong to a quote unquote minority group, once they have access to spaces that are quote unquote white spaces, we just, for what, we don't even question their track record. We don't look at what they have done in terms of facts, but we get caught up with symbolism, with this idea that they made it. And my question is, they made it where? For what purpose? What are they doing? And why is it that their mere presence in a space of power is supposed to be revolutionary? Um, I cannot help but recognize with a certain kind of horror that race and gender and sexual orientation have become a very important form of symbolic capital for minority elites. And I mean, including myself in the group. I'm not just saying that I'm holier than thou here. I'm part of that group, right? So Kamala Harris, historical triumph, Barack Obama's success, as far as I'm concerned, sublimates an hegemonic paradigms, that of capitalist democracy. Um, Media outlets, intellectuals, and politicians would have us believe that um, by selecting black representatives, somehow we're advancing mankind. But this is the integration of an elite group already. And the masses are supposed to identify with them. I would like people to think about the social background and cultural background of Barack Obama and Kamala Harris. and compare that to the social background of someone from the south side of Chicago. People always bring up the Michelle Obama example, of course, but I'm talking also about others. For one Barack Obama or one Kamala Harris or one Michelle Obama, how many other people do not make it? How many other people are in jail? Can we bring up some statistics? You know, I think there's a certain kind of collective delirium. But I understand. I was part of that group. So when Barack Obama spoke at my commencement ceremony, I graduated from Northwestern University, and my parents and my sister came, and there was something about, at the time he was a senator, you know, the way he walked, the way he talked, and he has this very charismatic appeal. And at the time, he was telling all of us all the things that we needed to hear. You know, you can be the change you want to see in the world. You know, we are the ones we've been waiting for. You know, he was talking about redistributing wealth, etc. So we were like, this is very different. And we had, before that, George Bush, the war, etc. It wasn't really pleasant. So people were looking for a change you can believe in, right? So I'm not saying that I was always on that side of history, but you live and you learn, and then you start questioning the ways in which all those specific identities should help us look at the fragmentations of the black, so-called black community, right? And how those people become part of a system. They never transform it because they stand to benefit from it. There is a fact, I think, an alliance of converging interests between democratic white middle class and the aspiration of the minority elites. And I'm not judging here, it's just a fact. But this idea that this is how we're going to change the world is not about expanding that capitalist pie. You cannot expand it. By definition, it is exclusionary. It will always pick and choose some people, but this is not a sustainable model for progress. And then we don't even question the policies that those people implement, you know. So that's where I'm coming from. And when I think about diversity, I think that because of white supremacist heteropatriarchy, we are accustomed to think about diversity in terms of bodies, race, and social orientation. Why? Because LGBTQI plus people have been ostracized and oppressed. Non-white people have been ostracized and oppressed. Bodies, racialized bodies, but we can also talk about, you know, this whole field about abilities and disabilities also. Certain bodies, certain races, and certain sexual orientation have been excluded, right? Mm-hmm. So today when we think about diversity, we think about using those specificities as currencies to become part of a space. And we believe that just by being in the space is transformed. No, you can be black, you can be a woman, but you can be conservative. You're not necessarily progressive, or you can be progressive to advance your interest as a black woman, not necessarily the interest of black men, and vice versa, right? But because of this white supremacist heteropatriarchy, we are caught up with bodies, race, and sexual orientation. So, we're in the room is diverse. No. I'm interested in the diversity of opinions today, regardless of your racial background. Because sometimes, even amongst those groups, some people are silenced. Some people are ostracized because they don't think differently. But at the same time, we're always screaming, black people are not a monolith, you know? So I think there are ways in which we need to find a way to advocate for diversity of thought, you know, for cognitive diversity for all of us. Because now people also assume that because you look a certain kind of way, you have a certain kind of sexuality, you're supposed to be thinking this kind of way. So I think there's a certain struggle between prescriptive identities that leads to a certain kind of understanding, but very superficial understanding of diversity, which makes sense considering white supremacist heteropatriarchy. But at the same time, what about cognitive diversity? What about diversity of thought, even amongst minority group? And it's a very difficult question that we really have to tackle. You know, lately we have been dealing with this anti-Asian racism in this country. And it's very difficult to have those conversations about quote unquote intersectionality and solidarity, because prior to this white man going on a shooting rampage, for some reason you had a bunch of videos circulating on social media where you will see people of Asian descent being assaulted by people who look like me. But then you will watch the news, they will never say black people. They will just bombard you with those videos. But then on the other hand, black people will bring up Latasha Harlings, who was a young black girl who was shot in the back of her head by a Korean lady who owned a grocery store for an orange juice that she was willing to pay. And then she never went to jail because the white female judge thought that she was an honorary white citizen. I don't even think she did community work. And you have a lot of videos also showing Asians beating up black women in nail salons. There's a very contentious situation here. But then you have this white man who killed a bunch of Asian ladies, and the narrative shift. At first, people were like, well, black people are a victim of racism. Asians are, well, we're being victimized by black people, but we're not really going to bring up the racial identity of the people we see in the videos. Now you have this narrative about white supremacy. Because this white man is so stereotypical. The struggle between the body and the spirit, the puritanism, this idea of purity, and the racializing of a certain kind of industry. People are not finding a way to, how do you create a language? That's where connective thought, thinking is very important. Diversity of thinking. Because I don't believe there will ever be solidarity between black people and Asian people if we don't bring out the skeletons that are in our closets. What do I mean by that? The colorism in the Asian community, in East Asian community, you need to address that first. And also, a lot of black people are like, where were you when they were abusing us? And you too abuse us. So we find ourselves in this strange space where it's very easy to get together when you're just pointing the finger at white supremacy. But once you have to deal with each other and with really human problems, we don't have this language that we need to address, because is there any type of solidarity with black people in China? What about the caste system in India? But we find ourselves here, all of a sudden, kumbaya, BIPOC, we all together in this struggle against white supremacy. I'm sorry, it is not, it is important, but it's kind of disingenuous as well. And I know it's uncomfortable, but there's no way we can going to create a better society if we don't deal with those issues. And I think at that point, diversity of thought is important, because something needs to be addressed there. So I don't know if I answer your question, but in a nutshell, that's how I look at it.
You have, Natalie, in more ways than I sort of was expecting. So thank you for a really rich and varied answer. I think what you say there is something that we need to take on board with regards to diversifying diversity, and also about addressing issues or thinking about things like colorism and having difficult conversations. In the end, it is about conversations, and we are living in a world of social media and recordings and conversations that are monologues rather than dialogues. So, hopefully when we get back to the world where we kind of sit together or are able to meet in rooms, that those are the places where we can have some real conversations, and the fact that it's not like an Olympic, as someone said,
Operation Olympics.
Yeah, Operation Olympics, right? It's about other things as well. So just one last question. I know we're out of time, and it's absolutely wonderful to talk to you. There's so many things that I want to continue to kind of get you to draw you out on. But the last thing I want to draw you out on is because this is something that's affected my university as well. And I think it's important to sort of have the last question as this question, if it's okay. And so I'm going to shelve the question about white privilege and white fragility, because in a sense you've addressed it already. And if maybe that's something we can come back to in a future conversation. But in the book, you say in the United States, And the N word, which is my sort of reference, not your reference. In the United States, the N word is not just any old word. When used by a white person, no matter the context, the term has an injurious connotation. When white people pronounce the N word, it carries with it the memory of the violence that legitimated the subjection of blacks and the negation of their humanity. The racist graffiti caused outrage, referring to an incident at the Liberal Arts College where you work in 2015. You narrate how a group of students stormed the home of the college president, which was at a stone's throw from the campus. And they also spoke before TV cameras. You mentioned accusations of racism, anti-Semitism, and Islamophobia prior to this. So we are kind of in a similar situation. You might have
Oh,
heard
really?
at our institution, which has kind of come to a head around the use of the N word by our sort of director, who is, and there's an ongoing investigation. So
What was the context?
it was in a student meeting. It was in a
Oh,
student meeting, and he was asked to respond to it, and he said the N word instead of
oh
saying the N
Lord.
word. And he's South African, Asian, so it's lots of things
It's
have come to the
complicated.
forefront. It's very complicated, and South Africa is also kind of the center of the conversation. So it's a very different but similar institution, and I'm curious to hear about your experience. What was the learning and unlearning that came out of it for you, the students and the administration?
Well, unlike your situation, it's one thing to have someone speak the word out loud.
Hmm.
In the situation that I described, there was a graffiti
Hmm.
in the bathroom stall. So they did not know who actually wrote it. So you see, there's a certain kind of anonymity there that I think creates a different type of environment. So you couldn't necessarily point at an individual,
Hmm.
but it was about challenging a certain kind of anti-black campus climate. But then it was a lot going on at that time because the week prior to that we have the situation with Islamophobia and anti-Semitism. It was a lot. So, and I think the problem when those incidents happen is that the administration and the faculty are not on the same page, and also the faculty members are divided amongst themselves too, because usually the colleague who's involved in the situation is also someone friends and is also a colleague. So you always have people standing up to defend their friends and other people standing up for what they think is right and how we should behave regarding certain issues. And I think the administration is only interested in damage control and not getting the word out there, not having the press involved. And I think there's a certain kind of panic that takes precedent over critical thinking, over everything. And there's also a certain kind of instrumentalizing of students. Because what really struck me at that time was how emotional the students were and all the expectations they had from the administration. And I was just thinking, these people will never give you that. These are not, but there are ways in which, I don't know about your school, liberal colleges here tend to portray themselves as a community. We use the language of community a lot, which is really pragmatic because what makes a community a community? It's the relationship that people have with each other. It's not a slogan on the website. So a lot of students believe in this idea of community, and something like this occurs, and the response is not really what it's supposed to be, and you will just have a conflict. I personally, what I decided to do at that point, because I was more of a, I was not, was I tenured at the time? Yes, I was tenured, but I was kind of removed from the situation. I wasn't woke at that time. I was just, I guess, I was still
Like
a
Barack
black
Obama.
female immigrant trying to do what she has to do and stay out of trouble. But then I realized life is not like that. I care about these people. I care about these students. And if I am here, able to enjoy whatever I think I'm enjoying, it's because people did something to create a space for me to be here. So I'm not saying that I'm a revolutionary, but I took my struggle in the classroom. And how do I develop a curriculum that let these black students and white students also know what does it mean to exist as a black person. So I created one of my favorite courses, Existence in Black, so that people can have an understanding of who they are, not from a place of victimhood, but as a human being dealing with human problems. What does it mean to be human in a dehumanized world? How do people survive? What are the techniques and strategies of survival? What are the contradictions? What are the problems for the black modern subject in a white supremacist America? So you confront Du Bois with Garvey, Malcolm X with Luther King. You read some James Baldwin, some Ralph Ellison. You listen to black music because black music is a meditation on life, is a way of understanding the human condition in black skin. And you expose students to that wide range of material. And I have to tell you that in my courses, I almost never use the word white privilege. And there's a reason for that. I think it describes a reality, but how efficient it is at changing the reality. That's the question I have. It's very polarizing. And then it's all about white people again. So it's like, well, white privilege is real, you know. It's been real since 1492 when Christopher Columbus got lost, but they said he discovered America. But what have black people been done? And not only black people, but people who were oppressed and dispossessed. They still had a life to live. They have children to raise, even when they were taken away, someone to love. What about that part? Why do you want me to spend my life talking about the fact that white people need to acknowledge their privilege? Again, I'm not saying the word does not describe a reality. I'm just questioning how efficient is that word at transforming the reality, and what are the consequences of that world when we try to create a space to engage each other. What fragility describes a reality? I've seen it. You find yourself in a room, you say something, and people who think that they are allies start crying and get mad because how dare you challenge them? They're on the right side of history. And then it's about them again. There are ways in which those words decenter blackness and keep on recentering whiteness. So I do not question what they describe, but I'm concerned about the ways in which they surrender the power of change to white people. Because the question is, what if they don't change? What if they don't acknowledge their privilege? Don't you still have something to do? A paper to write, somewhere to go, a party to attend? What do you do in the process? We have to fight, but I think white people like using those words to make the conversation about themselves. You have what I call the good white people and the bad white people. The good white people are like, yeah, that's wrong. They watch CNN and MSNBC. And the bad white people watch Fox News. I'm like, again, I'm a tool here. They're using me for their narcissism and their ego. Even this idea of allies. Why can't you just be a good human being? Why do you have to be an ally? Why can't you just do what's right?
Thank you very much, Natalie, for a wonderful conversation and the context of allies. And I would encourage everyone to go and read Shades of Black. It's a wonderful book, and congratulations on getting it out. And thank you once again to the festival organizers for setting these two conversations up. And